Welcome to The Great Awakening. I'm your host, Josh Daws. Several weeks ago, Kevin DeYoung released a thoughtful critique of Doug Wilson and his unique brand of cultural engagement that Kevin dubbed the Moscow Mood. Of course, Moscow being a reference to Moscow, Idaho, where Doug Wilson's ministry and his publishing company, Canon Press, operate out of. And I thought Kevin made some really interesting points. It was very thoughtful, very respectful. Obviously, has respect for Doug Wilson, but did raise some concerns with how they go about interacting with the culture. Some of the sarcastic, kind of biting commentary they do, especially when it's maybe directed at other Christians they disagree with. And so a lot of the guys there in Moscow had a lot of good responses to Kevin. This generated a ton of conversation. Doug himself responded several times. And, it's just been a topic of conversation the last few weeks. I'm just trying to bring you up to speed if you've been offline and kind of blissfully unaware of this. But one of the responses written by the guys in Moscow, defending the Moscow Mood, was by my good friend Joe Rigney, who was a recent guest on the show. He wrote, I thought, an excellent response to Kevin. And then a few days later, one of his friends, Samuel Parkison, wrote a response to Doug defending Kevin's critique and kind of adding some of his own critiques. So Joe reached out and asked if I would like to host a conversation between them. And I jumped at the chance. I think it's great when Christians who have significant disagreements, especially conservative Bible-believing Christians, when we can sit down and discuss these things like adults. And so I'm really grateful for Joe and Samuel being willing to do this and to model this type of discourse between mature adults, Bible-believing Christians. And so I think you're really going to enjoy this discussion about the Moscow Mood and the appropriate use of sarcasm and maybe coarse language for Christians, whether or not that's ever appropriate. When are we modeling, just kind of modeling some of this, the language that the Old Testament prophets used, and when is that, are we to avoid that? And so it's a great conversation. You're really going to enjoy that. But before we jump into that, I would like to tell you about the Worldview Youth Academy from the Ezra Institute. Hey parents, are you ready to level up your teens' understanding of life, culture, and faith? Send them to the Worldview Youth Academy. This is a great conference put on by the Ezra Institute this coming summer, July 12th through the 18th in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for students 14 through 18. And it will be an excellent opportunity to help transform their worldview, stimulate critical thinking, and give them an opportunity to engage with like-minded peers. The Ezra Institute is a great organization that specializes in worldview instruction for Christians, and so this is a great opportunity to help equip your kids for the world and the culture that they are going to be launching into very soon. Register now, and you can get the early bird price of $50 off your enrollment. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about this on The Great Awakening. Head to EzraInstitute.com to register today. All right, let's jump right into my conversation with Samuel and Joe. Hey guys, thanks for joining me.
Hey, glad to be here, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Glad to be here. Yep.
Awesome. So we're here to talk about the Moscow Mood. Most people are probably familiar with that now, but Kevin DeYoung coined that term, writing a critique of the, Doug Wilson's unique brand of cultural engagement, and Moscow being the town where their ministry, their church is headquartered there in Idaho. And you've each written a response to that, to Kevin DeYoung's critique. Joe, you went first, so I'm going to let you kind of sum up or kind of give us your response to Kevin DeYoung's piece.
Yeah, well, my thought in it had been that I thought Kevin's piece was really helpful in sort of raising all the right issues, but then had certain sort of challenges or questions that his piece raised that I don't think were adequately answered. Kind of clustered around a couple of issues. One would be just kind of the role of satire, since that was a big part of the criticism, was sort of the I think from Kevin's perspective, sort of the overemphasis or overuse of satire. He was willing to acknowledge that it was a valid tool, but sort of like Moscow does it too much, and sort of a little subtext of and seems to enjoy it too much, right? So it's not just that maybe satire is okay, but you have to use it reluctantly or something. So that was kind of one bucket of criticism that I thought that's a good thing to talk about. And the rough response there was kind of trying to frame satire as sort of two things. One is sort of an assertion of reality in the face of absurdity and evil. So when there's high-handed wickedness or low-handed wickedness, just when there's stuff like that you're asserting reality in the face of it, and with the sometimes with the intent to draw the laughter. In other words, to make evil appear as ridiculous as it is in the long run, and not take it as seriously as we sometimes do. But then the other piece, which I think is the one more maybe relevant for kind of where the discussion has gone, is the role of that sort of speech in talking to believers, other Christians, not just sort of severely compromised, or not just the prophets of Baal, where people seem to at least have a category for it, even if they don't often use it. But it's what's up with using satire or sort of pokey memes and things like that to other Christians, including Christians that you believe are sincere Christians, and sort of would be with you on a whole host of issues. And there, I think my issue is more. I think satire in that sense is a form of rebuke, and so it would fall under the larger category of rebuke in the scriptures. It's someone's going down a bad path, and you want to rebuke them. Well, there's different modes you could use to rebuke them, and satire is one, and it operates kind of on that dimmer switch where if it's not a huge thing, it's a little jab. If it's big compromise from a sincere Christian, then you might dial it up a little bit. But it operates on that dimmer switch, and therefore, if, as we all hope, I think all of us hope we are, if faithful are the wounds of a friend, if we ought to accept reproof and correction in order to learn and grow, then it seems to me that receiving the rebuke, even in the form of satire, would be kind of a humble thing to do, and not simply an offense at the form that the rebuke took. So that's maybe enough to get it started. There's other things we can, I'm sure, talk about, but maybe that's kind of like an initial one. And I appreciated Samuel's piece partly because he kind of agreed with that general point about satire, but seemed to think a little that Moscow was doing something different, or that it was out of order or something like that. So maybe he can speak to that, but that's kind of where I went with the satire question.
Yeah. I appreciated Samuel's response to that. And I should have said it at the beginning. You guys are friends.
Right.
You've both benefited from Doug Wilson and the kind of Moscow, the things they put out from Canon Press over the years. And so, I just want to thank both of you for willing to sit down and kind of like let's tackling this from different perspectives, and having a conversation about this rather than just sniping each other on Twitter. So Samuel, can you kind of sum up your response there, and what points you wanted to bring out in that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I think that in my response, I tried to interact with several things that Joe said in his piece, but when it comes to that particular principle, um, the satire as a rebuke operates on a dimmer switch. As Joe said, I agree with that in principle. But one of the things I try to bring out in the article is that it really is up to the person who's giving the rebuke to make sure that they have the relationship with the people that they're offering the rebuke to, so that it's actually received on a lighter point of the dimmer switch, to stick with that analogy, if that is in fact what they intend. So I understand, there are situations where people personally they take offense where no offense is given, and you can't constantly be walking around, apologizing for people who are motivated to be offended by you. But I do think that if you can't just simply assert, uh, oh, the things that I'm doing are, uh, they are that. They are the text thread with a group of guys that, we like to tease each other from time to time or something like that. Um, so like I could say, I'm friends with Joe, so I can like tease him. But if I start like insulting, if I were to bring up some uh give him like a really insulting nickname, and he didn't laugh initially, and then I kept on using it, I think most people watching would say, okay, this isn't just a gentle friend, sort of ribbing, a gentle ribbing from a friend. This is just bullying. And so I think that it really is incumbent upon the person who's uh, giving the rebuke to make sure that they have that the rebuke is actually being received in the spirit in which it's intended. Otherwise, yeah, I think maybe I'll just kind of stop there. But that was the response that I gave to that particular principle, is that the lower sort of rebuke on the dimmer switch, the lower level on the dimmer switch, is something that is created by the context of the relationship, and you can't simply just assert that it's a lower point of the dimmer switch, um, especially
Yeah,
if
and I think
yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
yeah, I think distinguishing between sort of that playful ribbing, which is a part of sort of male friendships, is kind of as sort of one category. And I think you're right. If it was, you took a shot, somebody got offended because you were being playful, and then you just kept doing it. I take that point in sort of a relational context. I think that the rebuke though would be like a step up from that, in that, hey, there's a concern here, and so the response is less important than sort of giving the correction. And so maybe like I think this does get at one of the central, I don't know, issues I think people have to weigh in terms of the analyzing what's legitimate kind of speech, and how we relate to one another. 'Cause I think everybody sort of admires John Piper for the rebuke he gave to Doug like 20 something years ago at like a League in Year conference, right? There's this clip that kind of circulates every so often, where they're on a panel and John sort of chides them for not enough tears, for the credenda, basically for the Moscow mood, but like this is like 2002.
Mm.
Um, and I think everybody recognizes like, hey, like the John wasn't that great of John to offer that criticism, and it was done in a very Piperian way. Like it was earnest. It was done in the way that you would expect John to be, given his personality and ethos that he exudes. Um, and so I think the question is that the only way that a rebuke like that could be given, or would the playfulness in a different format? Because I think in person it probably would be inappropriate in some ways to do that. There's certain things that wouldn't be appropriate in a one-on-one face-to-face kind of interaction, but that I think the internet in particular, that writing in particular, are different means or different lanes. And so one of the things I've heard Doug say before that I think is helpful is you don't drive on the sidewalk. And so there's certain things that you would say in an article, on an in a tweet or something like that, that would be more punchy, have a little more zip to it, that you wouldn't say to sort of to someone's face because you don't drive on the sidewalk. And I think that some of what's going on here is when Doug writes the way he writes, or things like that, that there's a particular venue. This was part of what I was getting at in my article, saying, for Kevin to object to sort of Doug's online persona, and to sort of the canon Twitter account, because of all of the satire that was being used, is like going to a football game and then objecting that there was so much hitting going on. It's like this is the place where that happens. Whereas I think if you actually sort of go back and look at, well, how has Doug, say, for example, or me, or any of the folks out here conducted themselves in a personal context, and this kind of thing, it's different because it's not, because of the mode or the context. So I think that's another element to this. But the larger question really is, if Piper giving a sort of sincere rebuke in person is an appropriate thing to do, and Doug received it. He kind of he joked about it, and kind of lightened the mood, but he received it. And I know that over the years, John's given similar sort of exhortations. I've been moderating them when those exhortations were given, or seen them in private. And I know that Doug's appreciated it when he's done it because of the directness. It's kind of that question of the mode, though. Like, does it have to be done in that sort of earnest form, or is there a place for that? Again, that satire as the form that the rebuke's given, and even with the examples kind of that we use, like the G3 guys, I think would be a good example, because that's one where there's been some poking. But it's really kind of come in response to a sense of, hey, I thought we were on the same team. There was a lot of commonality, and then there was this kind of persistent misrepresentation and unwillingness to sort of argue in good faith in articles or online. And so it was like the jab that was given was kind of a hey guys, knock that off. Like, hey, if it's going to be like that, then we can give as good as we get, and we'll just give it in a Moscow way versus sort of that more earnest way, which would be like on the lower end of that dimmer switch versus sort of the higher end stuff.
That is helpful to even hear you articulate sort of the intentionality between or behind being more punchy or more, if you wanted to say it in a less flattering way, more snarky online and in written form than you would be in person. And I almost wonder if that's precisely the opposite of the dynamic that it should be. In other words, it's harder to sort of set context, and in a conversation like this we can I can't see your face. We were talking about this before. I can't actually see anybody's faces, but ideally we would be able to see each other's facial expressions. We're reading body language. There's all of these other things that are kind of setting the context for the actual words that we're saying. And with the online the atmosphere that has been exacerbated by social media, it almost seems like it's more important now to kind of be more cautious about that sort of thing, because the likelihood of being misunderstood is greater online and with online articles and things like that than it would be if you were actually talking in person. And also just not just being misunderstood by the people that you're targeting, but, and this is one of the larger points that I was trying to bring out in my article, being misunderstood by everyone, by all the people who are looking on as well, because you may be intending, okay, this is a gentle rebuke that I'm offering to a friend, and I'm telling them to knock it off. But everybody else looking on is just, man, why are these guys? It seems like these guys are never serious. They're never earnest. They're just all they do is just sort of try to take the opportunity to sneer at everybody. And if I believe you when you say that that's not actually what Moscow is all about. But what I'm saying is, it seems like that kind of environment increases the likelihood of actually communicating that. Against your intentions.
Yeah. So maybe, and that's where, so on the venue or the form, it seems like Paul in the New Testament kind of runs into this a little bit. Like, he's criticized for, like, he's so listen to how strong he is in letters, but then in face to face he's like kind of weak, right? Like, there's this notion in his letters where he's having to respond to this objection that, boy, look how intense he is. He'll drop a hammer against the Corinthians, but then in person is much more meek, mild. And it seems to me that's part of where the rub comes, is that it seems like Paul recognized that there's certain things you can do in the written word that are appropriate, that if you were to do them face to face would have a different sort of register, precisely because it was face to face and there was all of the other context that you can use. I think the other thing to keep in mind is there is one aspect of the Moscow mentality, I think, in some of this is there's a willingness to take risks. So that you mentioned being cautious, and I think that's part of the I think there's a danger in sort of an over cautiousness or a reluctance to sort of disagree in public. And I think that some of the discomfort that comes from these conversations is, oh, these are all Christians. These are all Reformed Christians in many cases, right? And they're disagreeing in public. But I think that that's sort of like one of the things we've lost. I think one of the things I remember watching, even someone like Doug Wilson, when Doug debated Christopher Hitchens and they did that whole deal. Clearly, Hitchens had written some pretty excoriating things about Christianity, blasphemous things about Christianity. Doug had responded in his characteristic way, and yet there was a way in which they were able to kind of go on the road and do that documentary and do these sort of debates with a kind of as much friendship as you can have with a non-believer in that context, right? There was a mutual respect that came from the sparring because it was you can give as good as you get, and so I think that actually is instructive for us, and there's an almost like a how much more should Christians be able to sort of disagree, even to do the playful mood, because I think that sometimes I do get why people how to put it this way, using the word sneer and snark. I don't know that sneering and snarking is even the kind of like right categories for the kind of satire that comes out of Moscow, quite frankly. Like, I think that people hear it that way, but I don't know that, but that's certainly not the intent, because it implies a certain kind of contempt that maybe is true in the Lord holds them in derision for like high-handed sin, but with other Christians, there's always that sense of like, these are our people. So like there is a kind of general call it a Catholicity, like that part of the motive for the rebuke is like, hey, these are our people. We're all evangelicals. We're all Protestants. We're Reformed, and therefore there's a kind of hey boys, fight better. Hey boys, don't make that mistake mentality that kind of runs through here, and a willingness to say it out loud and to take the lumps, as opposed to, I think, another way to deal with that is all kind of behind the scenes, and that happens here too. Like there's, oh, hey, that was a whiff. Hey, that didn't land or whatever. There's criticisms like that go on behind the scenes here as well. But there's a greater tolerance for take the shot, even if it's risky.
Yeah. I think this is another sort of helpful clarification, because we're moving now into another part of the dialogue. Just in terms of like the when we're thinking about a sense of propriety, right? So you talked about there's different avenues that are appropriate to use a particular way of talking, and you were talking about the sort of the spirit in which these things are given. There's a part of what I was bringing up in my article is I'm sensing, just in my own assessment of Moscow and Canon Press and things like that, as somebody who has had every motivation to have a charitable interpretation of Moscow for years, I'm sensing just a sense of suspicion even arising in my own mind about the genuineness of that, because it seems like you can say that this is actually the spirit in which it is given, and yet there seems to me to be a incongruity between the occasional sort of the occasional kind of qualification that's given, that of the reminder of, hey everybody, we're on the same team. So you mentioned there were some examples of Doug basically saying these are bad reasons for leaving a church, so we're not actually trying to cause disunity in local churches, and whenever we hear about it, we're very unhappy about it. And so you can say things like that occasionally, but then the kind of thing that is modeled positively with many other articles, like I was just perusing blog and Mablog to just kind of rehearse my memory, and there was one article that I remember distinctly hearing. I had to get some help with a friend finding which one it was, but it was in 2019. There was this article, Woke or Awake, I think is the title, so people can look it up. And he essentially, this is an April article. This isn't even a November article. So he essentially just says, yeah, it's supposed to be, ostensibly it's supposed to be, but he essentially says, if your church isn't in an all out war, And the overwhelming impression that I got as I'm reading this is, if your church isn't doing it like Moscow is doing it, against wokeness and feminism and all of these things, then your church, your institution, your school, whatever it is, it's dead. Put a fork in it. And so then you ask the question, like, well, what exactly does it look like to be at war with these things? And uh, part of what he says in that article is that if there are people in your church who are advocating for female deacons, that's one of the things that falls into this category of sort of going woke. And so I think that's pretty extreme. And so when I talk about how there are people all over the world, frankly, and maybe we can bring the conversation to the global context in a little bit, but there are people all over the world who are reading the content from Moscow, and the thing that they are consistently absorbing, particularly from Doug, is that if there are churches that aren't doing it like we're doing it, they're compromised, they're woke. And then there will be the occasional article where it's like, okay, that's not actually what we're saying, but the what's actually being demonstrated by Doug with many of his articles is communicating the opposite of what he qualifies with, which is, because like in the article that you posted to on Twitter or on X, there was that line where he said, if your church is otherwise faithful in these other ways.
Mhm.
And so then, but then there's he doesn't provide a full definition, so we're kind of left to fill in the definition of what it actually looks like to be otherwise faithful. And for many readers, the impression is what it looks like to be otherwise faithful is to be like Christ Church. And so I just, it's hard for me to kind of coincide what you're saying about sort of the spirit in which these things are intended and the way that they're landing with, from an autobiographical note. I have found myself over the years at different points of being immersed in the Moscow content, needing to sort of dial back myself, because I am I'm not okay with what I'm seeing in my own heart. I'm seeing less fruit of the spirit. I'm seeing more, and I don't want to blame all of that with Moscow. Those are my issues. But there's something about it. It's easy for me to kind of come to the Moscow content and have those particular kinds of sins pampered when I'm in that setting. It's easy to not be confronted with those particular kinds of sins. The being quarrelsome, which is one of the qualifications of an elder. Yeah. So I've said a lot of things, but maybe I'll kind of stop there and let you respond.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, I can understand being mindful of your own temptations, but I think maybe one way to think about it is, I can see how certain things might feed certain temptations that we have. But I think that's true across the board. I don't think that's a unique to like the quarrelsomeness thing. In other words, there's a certain kind of calmness, peaceableness that I think people can imbibe and actually not recognize as leads to a kind of complacency or the wrong kind of when I was criticizing sort of the lust for respectability or the concern for what we're known for and sort of that sort of thing, that's a real prevalent danger, is to kind of cut ourselves off from like basically the hard edges of the Bible, which includes the sort of satire, which includes the sharp words, the prophetic words, is something that I think the evangelical church in general struggles with. Maybe to take it in a different context, like how many churches do you know that can actually like sing imprecatory psalms without flinching, right? Or even preach imprecatory psalms without flinching. And I think there's a lot of churches where they really can't, right? So whenever hey, we're going to sing psalms in certain places, it's the psalms, but sort of neutered psalms with all of the gnarly bits taken out. And I think that then cultivates certain kinds of ways of being that mean that we balk at sort of biblical modes of speech in their place. Now, that doesn't mean Moscow ever gets it all right or anything like that. But one of the things I've appreciated about it is precisely that attempt to have that fuller range, to sort of build up biblical have all the ways that the Bible talks, from the comfort and the gratitude and the joy, to the sharp edges, leveraged, both that we can use them, but also so that we can receive them. So that, if somebody does give the sharp rebuke, do I bow up, or do I slink away, or do I take offense and then that's it? Or is it an opportunity to grow, to learn, to repent if necessary? So I think that's another element. And I think even in your article, responding to me, I thought it was a good example, because there was a couple of places where I think you were kind of engaging in some kind of like caricature, like it was hyperbole. A couple of the, like, it's as though Moscow is saying, and then you would say something that would be a little more, it was hyperbolic. And I could feel the temptation in me to kind of go, hey, that's not fair. We don't, that's not what I think. But then I'd catch myself and go, but it's actually a way of making the point. And so, so caricature, hyperbole is a legitimate biblical tool, right? Jesus does it. The prophets do it. And so it's, can we sort of, see the hyperbole and say, is there anything to that? Is it actually caricaturing something, and that's bringing into sharp relief a real temptation, which I think is what I was attempting to do in my response to Kevin. Wasn't as much about like identifying Kevin's particular motives, but sort of identifying the temptations that I think would obtain in the circles that Kevin's in. And Kevin's a friend, and I appreciate a whole bunch about him. But it was sort of like, hey, in those circles, what's the actual temptation, and how is that being addressed? Because it's one thing to be able to sort of, this is a perennial human temptation, I think, is to always be attuned to the other guy's sins. Like, so it's easy to criticize that group over there for the ways they're getting it wrong. It's harder to actually say the thing about your own circles. And I think that's one of the things, again, that I've appreciated is Doug drawing boundaries on what things to the, sort of the right, are unacceptable. So he doesn't practice the sort of the gnarly view of no enemies to the right. We never criticize to those quote unquote to the right, whatever that means. But we'll punch right, as needed, not reflexively, not sort of as a way of earning favor or tamping down the wrong accusations against us. But there's a way in which, like, that's necessary to kind of guard against the dangers that are going to fly in your circles. And so I think that's the but where does that come from? That ability to, like, actually criticize someone in public or in private, and then still have the relationship afterward. Well, it comes from practice. And I don't know that it's something that evangelicals are really good at. I think there was an era where we felt like theological disagreements could be done that way. So it's like, hey, I'm charismatic and you're a cessationist, so like we can talk about these issues but still be friends. Or Baptist and Presbyterian, we can talk about these issues and still be friends. That whole thing was there. Where I don't think has been as successful is, can we disagree on cultural matters or these sort of more practical things, and then still leave as friends? That seems to have been a harder sell. And I think part of the, maybe here's one other thing to stir in here. I do think that the satire bit, because it is an element of like a healthy immune system. Just like singing imprecatory psalms is an aspect of a healthy immune system. It cleans certain things out if you're able to speak plainly, directly, to mock what's mockable, and to hold in derision what God holds in derision. It's actually a really effective one. And I think its absence in more, I don't know, mainstream evangelical circles is part of an immune deficiency, which is why something like wokeness, for example, was able to infiltrate as far as it was. And Doug's rebuke of that in 2019 or whatever was a part of a recognition, like, this isn't kid stuff. Like, this is a rot that will kind of really, and I think that's been borne out in terms of the trajectories. I went back, it's amazing when you look at like where certain people were, who was able to get along a decade ago, and just how far they've drifted from each other over that 10 years, largely around whatever we mean by wokeness, and the sort of that cluster of issues was like a major dividing line. And I think Doug's concern to say, hey, if you're in a church where that stuff's tolerated, this is bad. You need to get out. But I think you could do that without by even saying what you said, which is, yeah, but is female deacons really a sign of that? And it's like, well, it might be if the push for female deacons is driven by a sort of, we need more representation of women in leadership, and we need more women up front. And so this is the sort of the next step along that, if it is sort of a sign, like that's a real thing. Or it could be, you know what, we just interpret First Timothy 3 to allow for it. And so we're going to do it not because of the wrong kinds of pressures, but because we're persuaded the Bible permits it. But that would, but like give it, and that's an example of, we're going to take the shot. Let's make the criticism, and then let people have to sift it.
Yeah.
There's something to that in my case.
I wonder if perhaps we give a bit too much credit to these ministries, as if they are, they're the ones kind of driving these kind of, I don't know. It's almost like there's two dispositions within evangelicalism, and this is the Moscow mood over here, and this is the TGC mood. And I wonder if we're maybe thinking about it wrong. Like, maybe the tail is wagging the dog, and these are, people are attracted. The Moscow mood is not creating this contentiousness online, but maybe there's a reaction to problems that just regular people in the pews have noticed over the years, that makes what's happening in Moscow and their type of engagement really appealing. Because I think a lot of the criticisms I've seen kind of paint with a broad brush. I know a lot of the criticisms of G3 involved a lot of like memes with clown shoes and that whole clown world stuff. I never saw any of that coming from Doug or any of the guys at Moscow, but I think they get kind of lumped in with that, just because there's this, I don't know, there's kind of this impulse to talk about things that we weren't, we're conditioned not to talk about. And for me, I'm much more dispositionally probably closer to Kevin DeYoung. Some of the words that Doug Wilson has used in print, I can't imagine myself writing that. And so to me, the appeal of Moscow has not been, ooh, yeah, this worldly appeal. I want to use words like that. And about time, we've got pastors, doing that. The appeal to me has been, this is a place that is not afraid to say what they really believe. And I think so much of our evangelical circles, we want to keep it on the theological, but avoid cultural. We want to, there's been countless things where, evangelical leaders will say, you should have, Democrats and Republicans on the same pew, and the gospel's enough to kind of unite that. And, but we will, split, denominations over like baptism and these other things that may not be a big, contentious thing like they were like, hundreds of years ago, and expect that there's somehow we're going to create this faux unity in our churches over, these really, really more divisive issues in our time. And I think there's just what's happened is we've not united over the gospel. We've just kept quiet about these issues. And suddenly there comes this church, this ministry that just lays it out there. This is what we believe about, education. This is what we believe about wokeness. This is what we believe about COVID. And that is just so appealing to people because, in our public, those of us that work in corporate America, we're always playing our cards close to our chest. And then we go to church and like, we don't want to cause any division. We don't want to, be the contentious one in the church. And so we play our cards close to our chest there. And so I think the Moscow appeal is just that, okay, it's okay to say what we think and figure out how to disagree as Christians.
That's actually a really helpful way of setting it up, because I think it brings some clarity to where the objection to the Moscow mood is coming from, which is not that Moscow errs in advocating for saying what you believe, or not apologizing for saying what you believe. That's not the objection. The objection has everything to do with kind of coming back to what you were saying, Joe, in terms of policing your own ranks, that sort of thing. It's basically saying, well, we're not objecting to you speaking prophetically about, truthfully about these things. We're objecting to I mean, so there's a handful of objections that are coming out in these various pieces, but on one particular piece, when we're talking about the language that uses, you Josh just said that there's some of the language, some of the colorful language that Doug will occasionally use are things that you would never use, and that's one of the objections is to say that's not just prophetic language. We would see that as I would see that as a violation of uh, the charge for an elder to be respectable or dignified. He's a pastor. Doug's a pastor. He's never not a pastor until he steps down. It's not like he can take his pastor hat off and, okay, now I'm a pundit, and I can do things like Matt Walsh. He's always a pastor. So that sort of requirement to be respectable and dignified is actually there. And it's very easy to sort of like turn that to sort of have a faux version of being dignified that is really just adhering to the idol of respectability. But I want to say, yeah, but at the end of the day, there is a legitimate version of that thing. And what it does is it refuses to use the kind of language that's prohibited in Ephesians 5:4, which is an actual category. That's it's not just something where we can say context always determines it. I think what Paul is talking about is there is a particular way of talking that is always unacceptable for Christians. And so I would say the issue is not being willing to speak prophetically or the issue is not that we're unafraid that we should be afraid to do things that sort of go against the typical evangelical status quo. Like our church, we sing imprecatory psalms, but I think that there are faithful Reformed churches that sing imprecatory psalms, and they have pastors who tell the truth about all of the issues that we're talking about, but they never have they don't typically feel the need to do it in the way that we're objecting to, which is the particular kind of language, the particular kind of posture. And so I think maybe we could illustrate this way. It was instructive for me that that Doug felt the need to kind of like give out there's two ways of interpreting when Kevin first wrote his article, and he basically said, hey, everybody take it easy. Don't jump down Kevin's throat. On one level, I believe that Doug was sincere when he said, I respect Kevin, be respectful. But I also think that there is something in the water that he felt the need to say that because otherwise, if he hadn't said that, what might the response have been? And I just don't see it's I struggle to see in other ministries. I know they have different ministries have different temptations, which is the main point that you're bringing up, Joe. But I think it is telling that I can identify pastors and churches and other ministries who are doing faithful work who have not been compromised, but they don't sort of create the kind of culture among their following where they have to sort of give out an alarm to take it easy on their opponents, because they know that if they don't say that, they might jump down the throats of their opponents. So that's kind of that's getting closer at sort of what is it that we're objecting to? It's not that Moscow's telling the truth and being prophetic and being courageous and all of those things, because I think there's ways of actually doing all of those things that don't require what we would consider to be violation of it's biblical standards that we're sort of holding up. It's not you're offending our sensibilities. It is, this doesn't seem to jive with what we're reading in the New Testament for how pastors should behave themselves and how Christians should talk.
Yeah, and I think on the language piece, I think there is just a kind of a baseline. It isn't. It's at some level like an exegesis application question. Um, so out here, we think that when Doug, in the handful of times over millions of words, has used the strongest language, that's basically an application of the kind of speech that the Bible engages in, like when Ezekiel compares idolatry to um, whoring after the genitals of donkeys. And I don't think I don't think it'll do to say that, like, if when Jeremiah is, or when Ezekiel's thinking through that and he's like, I'm gonna, whether if God inspired it directly or if it was came to him, however the process worked, but I'm going to compare Israel's idolatry to bestiality in very graphic terms. Like, I'm going to talk about the semen of the donkeys. I'm going to talk about the genitals of the donkeys. I'm going to use that imagery and I'm going to paint that picture as a way of rebuking this wickedness. That it seems unlikely to me that someone says, "Well, that's fine as long as you don't use a certain word." Right? Like, in other words, like the image itself is the thing that's offensive. It's the painting of the picture, and the word is often the way of like drawing attention to that. So at some level, like it's an exegesis question of like, is when Doug's done that in the handful of occasions when he has, is that him faithfully applying that mode of speech in a particular context, which is different than saying, hey, anytime you want to use a coarse word, use a coarse word, which he doesn't think,
Right.
or has never taught, or has rebuked, specifically. So this isn't just, hey, go shock your Aunt Millie. It's, hey, here's a particular context in which he's going to engage. I think it's been helpful for me to think of it as an act of translation. Like, here's a form of idolatry, here's a form of wickedness that is unrecognized for the shocking vulgarity and evil that it is. We've grown hardened to it. We've grown accustomed to it. And so how do you wake people up to it? Well, use language and analogies and images in order to shock the imagination, or to shock the sensibilities, to kind of go, whoa. And that's what Ezekiel, I think, is doing. It's what Isaiah is doing. It's what some of these other prophets are doing. That's what Hosea lived one of those, right? Like, I'm going to go marry the prostitute in order to make this point. And so at some level, there's an exegesis question there, but it's a complicated one, because I think this is the dilemma at some way, like under the surface in a lot of this, is I think that there's I think a number of folks can't decide, are there issues with Moscow? There's the kind of two kinds of categories for like separation in a circumstance like this. One would be sort of the Paul and the Jerusalem apostles in Galatians, where it's like, hey, you guys are going to the Gentiles, or I'm going to the Gentiles, you're going to the Jews. We're going to have different ministry philosophies, different practices that we're going to engage in. But hey, right hand of fellowship as you go. Remember the poor. We're on the same team, all things considered. But you're going to go do it your way. We're going to do it. I'm going to do it my way. And probably even a recognition there of like, and there's ways this could go wrong, like it ended up going wrong. Like, right, like those different missions then became this conflict at Antioch, where Peter withdraws from eating with Gentiles. So like, there's that kind of like, hey, we're going to go different ways, but we're on the same team, all things considered. And I think that's some of what I heard in Kevin's critique. It's some of what I hear in yours, which is sort of like hey, I think the long-term fruit of this, there's dangers down the road, there's a trajectory here. What's the fruit going to be? Is it going to encourage the wrong sort? Is it going to encourage vice or virtue, that kind of thing? But it's a long-term ministry philosophy ethos question. But the other kind is really more of this disqualified now, like in stubborn sin now, not danger down the road, but like right now, like you're saying, if on your reading, it seems like Doug's disqualified for ministry because he's used these words and he's done so unrepentantly. He doesn't think he sinned in doing it, and has defended it. Well, that's a different sort of issue in terms of your orientation to that. So that kind of category, in my mind, is much more like Paul with John Mark in Book of Acts, where John Mark had sinned and withdrawn or something like that, and left them. And then they're going to go visit the churches, and Barnabas is like, I want to take John Mark, and Paul's like, no, he's disqualified. Basically, I can't partner with him. We can't go. And the hard part there, I think, for Paul, in his mind, is like, he didn't just lose John Mark, he lost Barnabas too, right? Like, Barnabas and John Mark ended up going, and Paul took Silas. But that was like a different kind. And I think that there's like some of the challenges, like for critics of Moscow, like which category does this belong in? Is this just a different ethos? Is this just a different philosophy of ministry where we can say, hey, let Moscow be Moscow, let DeYoung be DeYoung, let the PCA be, let TGC be, like everybody's got different ethos. That's fine. That's one kind of differentiation, one kind of distinction. The other is a more grave one, and it's Kevin's original piece seemed like it was mainly that first kind with like a hint of that second when it got to the strong language. But I think that's actually like the big a big question, and is why there's this kind of like the embargo on all things Moscow kind of persists because it can't quite decide. Are we going to sort of force all the Barnabases in our midst to choose sides, right? That's the sort of I think that under the surface of some of these tensions is
I think that's
that dilemma.
A good way of articulating it, and I would actually agree with you that is actually the dilemma, and I think that it's appropriate for us to identify that as a legitimate dilemma because some of these things of at what point is an elder like some of these things are when you're looking at the qualifications of an elder, it's very easy to sort of say like, okay, this person is not, this man, he cheats on his wife. He's not a one woman man. That is a qualification that immediately he falls over.
Right.
But some of those other things, the when the line is crossed, like being respectable, when is actually the line crossed of okay, we're not actually being dignified. Okay, an elder actually is quarrelsome. Those are things that are weighed not in terms of like a single action, but like a pattern of behavior. The sort of the like what you're saying, like the long term sort of the fruit of a ministry, the long term sort of example of the ministry, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you kind of put your finger on why I am sitting where I'm sitting in terms of I've benefited from things in this ministry in the past, but I find myself recoiling more and more. And I really don't think it's because I'm afraid of how I'm being perceived by other people. That might be there. I'm I recognize that there's all sorts of motivations and inclinations of the heart that I'm unaware of. But I don't think that that's what it is, because I have always been okay with taking lumps for being on the sympathetic to Moscow side of things, or whatever, and these are things that I'm learning from you and from Doug, and to be courageous and tell the truth. And but all that being the case, I still find myself, and I think it's because I'm looking at those kinds of qualifications and I'm saying, okay, at what point is the line actually crossed? Because it seems to me like some of these ways of sort of engaging, it's not just that you're engaged, that it's Doug's engaging with the culture. It is there's a particular, and this kind of comes back to the worldliness thing. That was another piece that sort of maybe we're working with multiple definitions of worldliness, and that was my objection to Doug, is that it seemed like he was only interacting with one category of worldliness. That there's a category.
Yeah, I thought
of worldliness. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought that was your best point in your article, because I had the same thought when I read Doug's response, that there's probably different areas of worldliness that were not fully explored there.
Yeah, and so one of the categories of worldliness is I'm just wanting to sort of be I'm wanting to sort of get sympathies from the world. I'm doing the things that I do so that I look good in the eyes of the world. But there's another kind of worldliness that the effect of it is that that basically the kind of worldliness that I was describing, and that I think gets at sort of what DeYoung was talking about when he was saying that there are fleshly or worldly ways of doing this kind of prophetic ministry that Doug is engaged in, and that is doing it in a way that is worldly. So it's not to win the esteem of the world, but it's doing it in a worldly way. And when there's that classic Narnian example of Peter and Prince Caspian, when he's fighting Miraz and he falls on the ground and he doesn't slay him because he's behaving like a Narnian when he fights. And I'm saying this to the author of Live Like a Narnian, so the argument that I'm making here. So
I agree. I agree
that
with
is
that.
the objection. It's not
Yeah.
that Doug is doing prophetic ministry and he should stop that. It is he's doing prophetic ministry in a way that the prophetic edge is lost precisely because he's not doing it like he's not doing it in a godly way. He's doing it in a way that is just if we're talking about prophetic ministry, I think pulpit ministry is sort of the burning center of the prophetic call of the church. And I think it's telling that the kind of language that we're objecting to and the kind of posture, the kind of the Moscow mood, so to speak, is all there in sort of the public discourse in terms of like writing and stuff like that, but it's completely absent from the pulpit ministry. And I think that's a good thing. My favorite parts of Doug's ministry is his preaching ministry, but I just think it's telling that, okay, if that's where the hearth of prophetic ministry is, then why isn't it also acceptable to use that kind of language, that kind of imagery, those kinds of strategies in the pulpit ministry? And I think it's because even in terms of like a sense of propriety, even Moscow has limits for what would be inappropriate in a particular setting. And what I'm trying to say is there's a way to be prophetic without sort of crossing those lines of propriety. I don't think that you have to be inappropriate to be prophetic. And so the charge is what Doug is doing and what is sort of girded up by the social media presence of Canon Press and that sort of thing is crossing the line of being inappropriate to try to be prophetic when that's not actually necessary. You can be prophetic without actually being inappropriate in those lines.
Yeah, but I think that's where the question of like, if your definition of respectable for an elder would rule out Ezekiel, right? Like I think that's like at the end of the day, that's like, so the model here is there are these examples of this strong speech, and I don't think Ezekiel would have given, and if Ezekiel would not have gone, I don't think, to a sort of faithful, I guess they didn't have synagogues in his day, but whatever the equivalent gathering of Jews would be, these are faithful Jews, God-fearing Jews who are faithful, and I don't think he would have unloaded on them the way he did about the idolatries. He addressed that to those who were committing it, right? Go say to the house of Israel, go say to the idolaters, this is what you're doing. Just like Elijah is the one who says it to the prophets of Baal standing right there. So the reason that I don't think Doug's pulpit ministry is marked by that kind of sharp speech, meaning the coarse language particularly, is because that's not what's happening in the Christ Church community. Like it's not needed there. It's instead what's needed there is just normal, faithful shepherding of Christians, with appropriate rebukes in terms of just, hey, here's some sins that are going to happen in your home, and so dad, don't do that. Well, wives shouldn't do this, but like not the high, the high speech of the prophetic serrated edge. Whereas I think that in terms of like the modern, what's the equivalent in the modern context? It would be something like what he's doing on his blog, or if he were to ever address Congress or something like that, maybe there would be a place, like there would be places where it could be appropriate to do something like that, even verbally. But I think that's that lane idea. It's like, this is the lane for that. This is the lane where we imitate Ezekiel's grotesque imagery, and we do it in proportion. Again, like I think his response to Kevin was basically like, Kevin took out of millions of words, took the little peppers that were sort of laced throughout the whole ministry and like concentrated them into one paragraph in order to like light your hair on fire. And it's like, well, yeah, if you do that, people are going to react like, whoa, it makes him sound like he cusses like a sailor, when that's not actually the case.
Yeah.
These are targeted and intentional. And I think and I think to the worldliness question, I agree with Josh that I thought that was an astute point to say, hey, there's a kind of lust for respectability by the world, and then there's a kind of imitation of the world's methods, which I think is what you were saying, is like, are we imitating the world's methods? And it's like, well, not necessarily. The attempt is to imitate Ezekiel's methods, Elijah's methods, Isaiah's methods. Those were the methods that they used. Jesus's methods at times, in terms of the sharpness and the imagery that really rebukes high-handed sin. And so, if the fact that the unbelieving world also likes to dunk on people doesn't mean it was wrong when sort of Elijah dunked on the prophets of Baal, to use sort of our modern categories. Joshua, you have a question or thought?
Yeah, I think that's like you said, we're looking at like the coarse language is a small slice, in the over thousands of words. I think one of the objections that I seem to pick up from a lot of the responses and conversations coming out of this is that there seems to be a sense that it's wrong to enjoy the fight, to enjoy kind of tweaking the culture. I'm curious, Samuel, if you think that is what you would consider part of like what's inappropriate about the Moscow mood. Is it wrong to enjoy the fight somewhat?
Well, there's a way to enjoy it and a way not to. So that's actually a helpful kind of entry point to this other, maybe a clarifying principle. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I spoke out, being very critical of the kind of Christian disposition to say, the sin of empathy thing. I'm with Joe on that particular topic, and the sort of impulse to say like, okay, well, we can't actually celebrate. Now, Dagon has been beheaded and his hands are cut off, but we have to be reserved in the way that we kind of celebrate this whole thing. And I spoke out in opposition to that and basically said, no, we should be joyful. We should enjoy this victory and should be inspired for more of the fight, because now it's, one battle has been turned into 50 battles. So let's actually go out there and joyfully, engage in the fight. So I think that there's a kind of joy that is wholesome, but the kind of enjoyment, enjoyment that I'm concerned about is when we're the imitation of the world's methods kind of thing that I'm concerned about is not just necessarily the methods themselves, but the posture that we take as we're using those methods. So it's actually, it's not just like a joy of seeing God vindicated, or a joy of seeing holiness vindicated, or something like that, but almost like a joy of sort of maybe I could put it like this: the joy of getting to say things that we otherwise wouldn't get to say. So we're watching movies, you're watching the world sort of interact with one another, and there are sinful and cynical and pugilistic ways of sort of tearing each other down. And so I'm concerned that there's almost this sense of like, okay, well, I want to do that, but I can't do that all the time. So here's an opportunity for me to get to do something like that. This is an avenue where I'm allowed to use this kind of language and not cross a line. And I guess for me is that even a danger sort of on the radar for the Moscow world? And it kind of comes to another point of the criticism that I brought up in the article is, are there any internal breaks here? Is there a way to sort of like self-correct or acknowledge like, okay, I mean, maybe this would be a clarifying question. What would sort of qualify as a violation of Ephesians 5:4 in that avenue? It almost seems to me like, okay, but in this avenue, when we're doing sort of engaging the culture, prophetic speech kind of thing, this category of unwholesome speech is retired. I'm exaggerating here. I'm using hyperbole to illustrate the point, but that's kind of the broad
Yeah,
concern
no,
is
I get the point.
uh,
Yeah.
what would be a sort of what would it actually look like to violate that within that category? Because I'll end in with this. I think it is an exegetical point and a disagreement on the assessment of what is actually happening from Doug's ministry, which is uh, I agree conceptually with the prophetic language kind of thing, but what I'm saying is I don't see I don't think that those things are analogous. The uh, Ezekiel language and what Doug is doing, precisely because when Doug is sort of using those examples, I get the sense that it's worldly in the direction that I'm sort of warning against, and also because of the way that it sort of appeals to me. And the one thing that has been really encouraging by in this article is very there was a lot of trepidation for writing and publishing this article. I didn't really want to get involved, but the one thing that has been really encouraging to me is the amount of people who have reached out to me directly to say, this is exactly what I've been feeling as I think about this ministry, and the way that I've been assessing it is I like you have had every motivation in the world to have the most charitable, the most understanding, the most sympathetic sort of interpretation of Moscow. And despite that motivation to sort of be pro Moscow, I have found myself recoiling more and more. And that's the reason why.
Yeah, I think, well, so I think to the, is there could it cross the line? The answer to that is yes. I think two indications of that would be something like if it became cavalier. So, what would be a violation of the Ephesians 4 and 5 sort of condemnation would be if it became cavalier and just for grins, as opposed to targeted in a particular context. So if you just follow, if you were if you came out to a Sabbath dinner and everybody out here was just using all kinds of coarse language in the course of the dinner, then I think that'd be a sign of, hey, I think that you guys have missed the boat. Versus, whereas the fact is, like, you would never hear any of that kind of language just in common speech, because that's not where it belongs. And again, you don't drive on the sidewalk. This is for the high speed highway, and so that's where it shows up. I think the other thing of, is there breaks? The fact that Doug, I mean, Doug's got the retractions section on his blog, sort of when he makes factual errors. Here, I missed this one, or hey, this was a whiff, like he did during No Quarter November when the marketing guys at Canon put out an email that was dumb, and he just acknowledged it. I think that one thing it demonstrates is if he was persuaded that this was actually a violation of something in the Bible, he would be open in public about it, right? Like, in other words, he has a habit of and a whole place devoted to, hey, when I'm wrong, I'll acknowledge it, and knowing that my enemies might weaponize it, knowing that people are going to go, oh, see, we told you. That doesn't matter. It's the right thing to do. And so that's sort of built in as the need to, there's, and that's for particular kinds of things that require public, I don't know, take responsibility for things that have done in public. So that's what gives me confidence, quite frankly, that if he was persuaded, the issue is he hasn't been on any of the specific examples. Right. But then again, we're back to the Bible question. Like, is the use of certain language that's been objected to, is that analogous to Ezekiel or not? Or what would be, right? So I think that this is some of the things that I've felt is like, well, where is an example of something like that Ezekiel language in modern Christian thing? Because otherwise it's a deficiency, right? If we can't point to any examples of, hey, here's someone doing Ezekiel the right way, here's someone speaking the way the Bible speaks in the right way, it's all, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. It feels to me like I think the problem is going to end up being in our sensibilities are again deficient because we're not taking the whole Bible as God gave it to us. And I think that, and that would be sort of what's underneath, even if it's not, we wouldn't use that language because we want to be respected by the world. It's, we wouldn't use that language because we've been insufficiently discipled by the way Scripture talks, and so we can't drive in certain lanes because we've said nobody can go in those lanes. Those lanes are always sinful. And then we're over here going, what about, well, did Ezekiel drive in that lane? Well, you're not Ezekiel. Well, yeah, but I'm not. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that I can't image. We're all fallen. Any of them can be abused. The question is it possible to do them faithfully? Um, and I also think that there is just, quite frankly, like with the course language in particular, I think all of that could go away. In other words, like in the hypothetical world where Doug never used any of those languages, I think we still have the same problem. I think that often is the easiest place for people to go to say, like, what is it about the Moscow mood that is irritating, or that I don't like, or that offends me. I think that those words are the easiest place to go, but I do think it's a broader thing about whether it's the enjoyment of, we're going to engage in culture war, and we're going to run into the battle with spear raised and our for the joy in it.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna enjoy all the things we do, including that. Uh, I think that is some of the thing. Like, yeah, I don't know if we're allowed to, and it's the guilty pleasure uh, principle that people have, that, oh, we're doing something naughty, and that's not how we think about it out here. It's not like and I don't think any of us think. I mean, I've not used that language personally, and some of it's like, I'm not sure I'm sanctified enough to know when the right place to do it is. But it's not the case that there's 2% of the time where you get to sort of get a pass. Sometimes you get to be naughty. Sometimes you get to say bad words just for the fun of it. It's like, that's not the principle at all. It's sometimes the world's wickedness is so bad that the words that you need are
Yeah.
words that in other circumstances would be sinful for you to use. It's that, like if Ezekiel started talking about the emissions of donkeys at the
Yeah.
dinner table,
Yeah,
somebody
I
would have
think
gone, "Hey, man,
just
that's
to
not
maybe
this
put
is
a
not
bow
the
on
place."
this, we might be coming close to when we need to wrap up. I don't know when you want us to, Josh, but I want to put a bow on this and just have one more chart, encouragement or exhortation in another direction. But just to kind of wrap this principle up, I think I remain unconvinced that I mean I I'm going to be charitable and grant that may actually be sort of the intention, that Doug's trying to do the Ezekiel kind of coarse language sort of thing here, and to not just sort of be naughty and sort of appeal to the baser parts of uh, of the audience. Sort of give them an opportunity to chuckle, to language that they would otherwise feel guilty about. So that's not intentionally sort of how it's being that's not the intention behind it. But I remain still unconvinced that what's happening in Ezekiel is what Moscow is engaging in, and I think uh, yeah, I just that on that exegetical point, I just don't see it, because it does
Yeah.
seem to me like it's not like Ezekiel is saying, uh, this is the kind of language that you understand. Kind of going back to the Piperian exhortation there. Uh, I don't see uh, uh, like when Ezekiel sort of uses that language, there is a uh, grievous sort of um, outrage that Israel uh, has been so faithful to her covenant Lord, um, and it's not this sort of light. I'm going to poke fun of Israel's idolatry. It is a uh, very weighty, tearful, sorrowful kind of uh, charge of covenant unfaithfulness. And so it seems that the rebuke is different than the kind of thing uh, that I see from Doug, and the kind of thing that, I mean, again, I'm speaking from my own experience here. The kind of thing that uh, that appeals to the basest parts of my instincts when I'm reading Doug is to not say, okay, this is Doug being Ezekiel. It is rather, this is my opportunity to chuckle at language guilt free that I would otherwise be uncomfortable with. So So I guess we're at an impasse there. I just don't see the execution actually being what is it's intended to
Yeah.
be. Um, moving over to this other thing. Sorry, go ahead.
So then, yeah, I was going to say, I think then the question on that does come down. So, I don't think that the goal, Doug's aim in that is to communicate the gravity of the evil, not elicit the chuckle, the sort of guilty chuckle. It is to provoke a reaction. I think like this is what Ezekiel's doing: is here's a shocking image, here's a shocking word, here's a shocking thing to sort of shock people out of
Mhm.
their complacency relative to sins that have become normalized. So the when people read it and go, oh, like that actually is the reaction, and it's meant to provoke thought. It's meant to provoke like, whoa, what have we tolerated? Um, and does so it's an active translation, like I said. I think the question then becomes: does that difference of opinion about that practice or that and again that practice relatively rare speaking, does that sort of justify the sort of larger like
Yeah, yeah,
the sort of the informal embargo where nobody people accept an invitation and then rescind it whenever the people put pressure on them, or even just the more informal thing like you mentioned, you commended it, you said, hey, I appreciated this book or this what in your book, and somebody was like, I
yeah,
can't, this sort of second and third degree separation thing that then comes into play where if somebody's going to recommend that, then you're now suspect. And it's just sort of like this quarantine that has to get erected, and then everybody's uh, hey, I really like this Doug Wilson book on parenting, or I really like this
mhm.
Moscow video. And it's like, now you got to get policed. So is the difference that kind of, in other words, and maybe I wouldn't even go stronger. If everything in your article was right, your sort of response to me and all your points, does it justify the sort of I don't know, intense separation that seems to be demanded by a large portion of people versus like, hey, we disagree with that. We think that's wrong. But there's a lot of other good stuff that's there, which is, I think, how you kind of approach it. Like, hey, there's a lot of good stuff here, but I'm not sure I can recommend the whole. But it seems like there's something more that a lot of people have, and I think that's why it's a tension. That's why we're even talking about it. Like, because it's an issue in churches where you have lay people who like watch the Canon Plus app, and then elders find out about it and say, "Hey, you can't do that," or other leaders who get an invitation to come speak, and then they get pressured by others not to do it because your career will be threatened. And so it's like it's an issue under the surface in lots of places, and I think that's where like at some measure there is that differentiation. Which kind of difference is this? And because otherwise it's going to continue to churn, and it doesn't have to. Like, it's not churning out here, right? Like, it's not a churn. It's a, we're going to keep seeking to be faithful in the way that we have, but then and then let the chips fall.
Yeah. I think on that question of is the embargo still justified, even if everything that I said in my article was true, and I think the answer is it depends. I mean, it might be depending on the way that some of these things are manifesting themselves in different contexts, of churches. So you use the scenario of lay Christians listening to the Canon Press app, and then the pastors find out and they're objecting to it. I grant that that could be a scenario, but a scenario that I am more familiar with at the personal level, and also with direct friends and pastors who are experiencing this from their context, is less of oh, I found out that my parishioners are listening to Moscow and now I have to go uh, correct them. It is, man, some of these members have become nightmares. And what is it that's what where are they getting some of these ideas from, and then discovering that, oh, so it's not that it's uh hey, you are listening to Moscow's bad, so don't listen to Moscow, otherwise you might go off in poor directions. It's more like, man, these members are uh, really becoming problems, and it's hard to even sort of make peace with them. They seem motivated to not believe me when I say that I'm not woke, or whatever the case may be. And I can grant that is not that may not be the intentional uh, fruit of Moscow ministry, but it seems that from my vantage point, it seems that I mean there are particular cases that I can think of where that is undoubtedly a fruit, that scenario that I sort of described is a real one. And I think kind of bringing things over into the last sort of final exhortation that I would just give, to the Moscow world, if it's not too presumptuous of me, is to be conscientious of the way that these things are landing in other contexts. And so, like, for example, one of the things about like the global Christian dynamic is that even though numerically there are more Christians in the global South than in general than anywhere else, more professing Christians, it is still the case that Western Christianity is the hub of Christianity everywhere. I came here to this context. I'm in the Middle East, surrounded by, I'm in the UAE, so I'm in the very center of the 1040 window. And there's countries all around me that that are Muslim majority, that are Hindu majority, that I anticipated receiving all sorts of the baggage that I anticipated that I wasn't surprised by is Christians coming to seminary class with all sorts of baggage based on the different religious upbringing that they've had, or prosperity gospel ministry that they've had. But I'm here to kind of say everything that happens in the West is outsourced all over the rest of the globe to the majority of the world, including these niche corners of ministry like Moscow. So, for example, like during COVID, Abu Dhabi was one of the most tightly locked down cities in the world. It was intense. Our first year here, we had to get PCR tests every 2 weeks. We had little passports, things that we had to use all the time. So it was horrendous. And when asked sort of at the personal level, the response, from our pastors was, I think these things are, they're pointless. This is even say things like this might be unjust. But there were some members who left in a huff because they considered our church's adherence to the governmental sort of lockdown measures to be compromise. And I just am thoroughly convinced that actually would not, that here in this case, in many other contexts around the globe, that what is being portrayed as compromise actually isn't compromise. Like here in this context, if we would have sort of taken no, we're not going to wear the masks, we're going to come in, as many people as we want, we're not going to adhere to numbers in our building, then the past 50 years of Christian influence on this country would be drawn back. I mean, the 50 years of this particular church, ECC in Abu Dhabi, would we'd be going backwards 50 years. And so there was a strategic kind of, okay, we are going to adhere because this is a completely different dynamic than what's happening, in the global West or in America in particular. And so that's just one example, but there's many other examples of basically people absorbing ministry from Moscow and applying it within their contexts that are very different, not just culturally and globally, but even in churches around the U.S. And I just think that there should be there is kind of a This is maybe a serious charge. So whatever the lightest version of this charge is, I want you to hear that. But there seems to be a kind of Moat and Bailey kind of thing where it's sort of like we'll say outrageous things, in the Bailey, and then rush up into the Moat and say, but why is everybody freaking out? All we're saying is, and then you say the very modest version of that thing. But the problem is the thing that gets outsourced to all of these other churches is not the Moat very straightforward basic Christian thing. That's not the thing that gets outsourced and gets imbibed by people to sort of influence the way that they inhabit their local churches and the way that they interact with their pastors, and they assess their pastors and stuff like that. It's not the Moat statement that they're using to sort of make those assessments. It's the Bailey statement. And so I think that's just my sort of where I'm sitting from. I just wish that Moscow was more, and that Doug in particular was more conscientious of the way that his ministry is landing in all sorts of different contexts, that and kind of take ownership for that. Yeah, that may not be the intention, but duly noted that the as I'm sort of portraying these things or communicating these things, this is the way that it lands. And so I think that should inform the way that you all continue to do the cultural engagement sort of thing. Not necessarily saying everything that happens across the world is falls on the shoulders of Moscow, but at least let it inform the way that you sort of engage in these things.
And Joe, I'll let you respond in a second. I do need to land the plane here. But I think you did put your finger on some real issues. But I would just like to point out that I think those are larger issues that affect a lot of different ministries. I could give countless stories of people who come in, make the pastor's life miserable, with TGC articles of like, oh, you're not doing this right, or here's how we have to love our neighbors. And my own father had an awful time during COVID with his church from the other direction with members. Yeah, so I think it's a larger problem that is not fair to completely lay on at Moscow, but I think it is something that we need to be aware of. But Joe, I'll let you kind of respond to that, and then we can kind of wrap things up.
Yeah. Well, I think the simplest thing to say, I think at least when it comes to COVID, I think the goal, I wasn't here in Moscow for COVID, but I appreciated the way they handled it, precisely because they both pointed out the play that was being run, the tyranny that was being exercised in the name of health and safety and so forth, in the face of evidence, and in the suppression of evidence in relation to COVID and things like that, and then coupled with that was sort of the hey, give your if your pastor's faithful in other respects, if you've got into church and you're having to navigate these things, sort of be gracious to them, don't be a pill. And so I think if someone were to take the first part of that, hey, this is the state is engaged in a massive power grab, and this is not all that it's cracked up to be. If they were to take that and ignore this, they would have to ignore the second part in order to be difficult. And so there would be a case of like being insufficiently Moscow or something like that. So I do think that's I agree with Josh that it is a broader problem, and that the people will be distorted if they get a partial view, and especially when you've got how much Doug is written, how many words he writes, all as prolific as he is, you're going to pick up different things and then go off on a tangent. That's going to happen. But yeah, I appreciate be informed about the way things land. That's always a good word for pastors and leaders to keep in mind.
All right, guys. Well, I think this has been a great conversation. I appreciate the way you guys interact and hopefully this models a way to kind of handle these disagreements in public with charity. And yeah, so I'll give you guys any last things you're going to regret if you don't say.
No,
I'll just
I
say,
appreciate.
go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
Yeah, I just appreciated the discussion and the issues that it raises. I do think that they're important ones, and glad that Samuel was willing to have the discussion and press the points.
Yeah, I agree. I'm grateful for both of you guys, and longtime listener of your podcast, Josh. So I'm glad to get to actually be on it here, and thankful for Joe's ministry. I've been reading and commending Joe's books for a long time, and will continue to do so. And so, grateful for the opportunity to talk about these things and kind of give for you, Josh, to sort of create another avenue to let us kind of talk about these things in public with maybe some of the heated rhetoric stripped away, so we can kind of see clearly what is it that these two sides are kind of saying about this ministry. So just grateful for this conversation, and prayerful that it is fruitful and instructive for the people who are listening and watching.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it so much. That's our show for today. Big thanks to Samuel and Joe for joining me for this conversation. I'll have links in the show notes where you can read Kevin DeYoung's initial critique of the Moscow mood, and Joe's response, and then Samuel's response to Joe. I think they're all really helpful. They all make excellent points. So I think this is a great conversation, and I really appreciate Samuel and Joe coming on and having a mature discussion and really demonstrating how we can disagree well. I think that's something that we can all get better at, and Samuel and Joe have modeled how to do that, and so I really appreciate them for stepping up and handling this disagreement like adults and brothers in Christ. So because of that, I think this is a great episode to share with your friends. So send this to someone and further this conversation. I think this is a really important topic. If you're listening, ratings and reviews over at Apple Podcasts are always appreciated. If you're watching, be sure to hit like and subscribe so that you don't miss future content. And until next time, I will talk to you soon.